Okay, so you're clinically depressed, you have a learning disability, here's the medication. That's today. Then it was a narrative of, okay, well, let's look at the whole story. Let's bring in the whole team. What happened to you? How can we address that backstory? And that changed over the last 38 years with
your superhero origin story, your super brain origin story. How did all this get started?
Well, I've been in the field for 40 years now. It's like four decades. 38 years ago, I started my research journey, and I was always fascinated from a young child with the brain and mind, and I was always going to be a neurosurgeon. That was kind of always my thing, a neurosurgeon. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll be a psychiatrist, or no, I want actually to get my hands on the brain. And so that drove the passion. And then I ended up not doing medicine. I ended up doing a degree that was a combination of medicine, neuroscience, psychology, neuropsychology, and communication pathology. It was a pure experiment. It was the first time they'd ever done it. They took a seven-year degree and they squashed it into 4 years. And they thought, okay, let's see if we can train up a different kind of group of people. And there's only of us, I think 60 of us qualified in the world with that degree. And then they stopped it because the dropout rate was too high, because it was too demanding. Now, I say that to say that at the time I hated it, because we worked 7 days a week. We had no weekends. We were in the hospital, in clinics, in neuroscience lectures. We were doing 2 years. We did 2 full years of medicine. It was so demanding. But I am so grateful now, because that launched me into my honors, my master's, my PhD in understanding mind and brain, and understanding the difference and the relationship, and how the mind changes the brain, neuroplasticity, and how the mind influences not just the brain, but every cell of the body, and then the feedback loop between them, and just the power that we have over mind. So that journey is, and then, when I was in my early years studying, I remember talking to some of my professors, because in the 80s, and you may remember, may not be aware of this, but for example, Daniel Amen, who we both know, he's about 10 years older than what I am, and he was studying kind of over the same time period. So both of us were trained in that the brain couldn't change. So I was getting scientific lectures from my neuroscientist lectures saying that the brain can't change. And I had one neuroscience lecturer who said, I think this is wrong. And that just stimulated me. And so I started doing research showing that the mind is different from the brain, and that if you deliberately and intentionally use the mind, you can change the brain. And a lot of my professors told me that's a ridiculous question. I've in fact did a TED talk on this, and I showed. I said, okay, well, that's all I need is for someone to give me that kind of challenge. And I'll show how not ridiculous this is, because we keep changing as humans. So obviously, if we're changing and growing, it's logical. So I worked with traumatic brain injured patients. I decided to start there. And it's quite a nice story, because they, in the 80s and late 80s, all through the 70s and 80s, they weren't doing much research with people who had suffered brain damage from like a car accident, or from sports injuries like chronic traumatic encephalopathy, that kind of thing, because they believed that once the brain was damaged, that's it. So you just teach your patients to compensate. And I thought that's such a hopeless view. So I started working with people with like really bad brain damage, and I can tell you lots of stories. But the one very quick story is I worked with a young girl who had an accident at the age of 16. Prior to that, she was an average student, not very good, very average, but like not really, especially math was a problem for her. And I say that and you'll see why. And she had this terrible car accident. She was in a coma for 2 weeks. At that stage, they thought that if you're in a coma for longer than 8 hours, the brain damage was irreversible. So the message to her parents was that she had irreversible brain damage. She was going to be a vegetable. That's literally what they told the parents. And they said, if she comes around, she's not going to be able to do much. She did come around, and she fought back. And about a few months into her her healing, her parents contacted me. I was a very young scientist at that stage, new in this whole field. And I said, well, if you're prepared to like run with me as on a sort of research basis, let's see what happens. And within 8 months, this young girl, peer group, was in 12th grade. She wanted to get back to 12th grade and finish school. She had lost nearly 15 months or something. It's sort of almost a year of time, and she couldn't even cope on a second grade level. So we had 8 months to basically get her up to 12th grade and get her through 12th grade, which was literally an impossible task. I had no idea where it was going to go. She did it in 8 months using the systems that I developed, which I have refined over the last 38 years, and the most updated versions in this new book. This young girl applied these techniques. She worked with me, but she worked. So I can facilitate. We can't fix someone. So it's very key is a person actually doing the work, applying the system. And she went and finished school. Not only finished school, but her mathematical scores were genius level. When we did her IQ post post-trauma. So at the end of her school career, when she, with brain damage, which was healing, she had a higher IQ. In fact, they said she's off the charts, that she become a genius. And if you looked at her other IQ, her previous IQs, she was pretty much very average. So here is evidence, and then of someone who was an average student, kind of, and how with damage overcame the damage with mind and ended up being a phenomenal scholar, going on to get degrees. And she's one of thousands. And now we reach millions and we get these stories. I don't even work directly with all the millions, obviously, but the stories that we get back. And over my career of 38 years, the trajectory of my career, and in 25 years in clinical practice, and with work with thousands in research, we've seen this happening all the time. You get your mind right, you can overcome the traumas, the learning disabilities, the brain damage, etc., etc. So that's a long answer, Sean. Thank you for giving me time to answer in such a long way.
That's why we got you here. That's so powerful. That is so powerful. This is the reason that I'm so excited to talk with you.
Thank you.
Absolutely, like really, getting this truly. So many people. There's this concept of like having arrows in your back because you're heading the charge. You're going out and doing this before anybody else is even accepting it as possible.
Yeah.
And then having colleagues saying you're crazy, all this stuff. But then, having the proof. And by the way, so early on, even when I was in school, it was still largely held belief that the brain really can't change
Yeah.
much. Once you get brain damage,
That's it.
or once the decline, it's only decline.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing else. But then the concept of plasticity began to came up, and also now neurogenesis,
Exactly.
really being at the forefront. So, and here's the thing, though, is that, and this, it takes way too long for us to have proof for it to be used in clinical practice, to become accepted as true.
Exactly.
And that's one of the big issues with the system. And this is why I want to ask you about this next up, which is obviously mental health struggles and just that label. You talk about how, and this is one of the first things you cover in the book, how mental health struggles are not your identity.
Yes.
Can you extrapolate that a little bit?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you've asked that, because I watched this over my 38-year career, going from funnily enough, in the early 80s, where we thought the brain couldn't change. We had a better approach with mental health than we have now, where we know the brain can change. And I did some of the first neuroplasticity research in the world in my field in the 80s. And that was that time when I was told it was ridiculous. And it was only the mid-90s that people actually accepted that the brain could change. So it just shows you how recent it is. And so clinically, it's affected how people practice. So I've watched people going from having a holistic approach, looking at the person in context, their whole story, if someone's battling with whatever they're battling with, and also separating out things like, kind of looking at the whole person. So if you're battling with learning and you're battling with emotions, what happened? Not just lumping a label on because of the symptom. It was never, oh, you're battling with learning, you're battling with behavioral issues, and you're feeling very depressed. Okay, so you're clinically depressed, you have a learning disability, here's the medication. That's today. Then it was a narrative of, okay, well, let's look at the whole story. Let's bring in the whole team. What happened to you? How can we address that backstory? And that changed over the last 38 years with the advances of our understanding of the human brain, which we needed. With the advances in brain science, technology, medicine, this has taken us leaps into the future. But we've paid a huge price, and I talk about that in the book too. And that huge price is that we've forgotten about the narrative of the person. And there's very few clinicians and people in the field, and I mean, Daniel, Amin, and myself, and a few others are like, there's honestly, there's more now. But at one stage, there was, the going belief is that if you have depression, it's considered something like diabetes, and there's a chemical imbalance. And I mean, none of this is scientific. None of it's been proven. All of it is looking for some sort of neurobiological correlate that caused this depression. So it's like you've got this brain disease, and that's why you're depressed. No, you don't have a brain disease and that's making you depressed. You can have one and that can contribute, and there could be a tumor or something like that. But your mind is the overarching concept here. So you're a person who's experienced maybe trauma or abuse or whatever it may be, or COVID and grief and loss and financial. So when we're feeling mental health challenges, those are not illnesses. they are actually responses, and they are symptoms of an underlying issue, and they're warning signals that we need to listen to. And if we don't listen to them and we just stick a label on and people take that on as their identity, it changes the brain, it changes the body, and I'll show you how in a moment. But what essentially that does is, in the context of psychology and in population statistics and what happens to humanity, is when you ignore a person's story and you don't allow a person to express and find the cause and the origin, what you do is remove a whole component of a person's functioning. You literally ignore 90% of how they're functioning. You focus just on the biological, which works great if you've got heart disease or something physically wrong with your body. But when we've got a story in our life, which all of us do have, we have to focus on that. So we see what we saw happening from the mid-90s when neuroplasticity was at its sort of accepted and growing. We saw that leap in medicine, technology, neuroscience. We saw a backward movement, however, in mind. So people then started cutting out the story of mind and saying, well, we can't really measure it. So let's focus just on the biology. Let's make everything about the biology of the brain, and it's brain, 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 and forget all about the experience. And that has resulted in a current trend that people don't talk about enough, but it's called deaths of despair. And what is happening now in our current age in 2021, and it started in 96 and it peaked, it was really identified between 14 and 15, and it's a massive problem currently, and that is that people are dying 8 to 25 years younger than they should from preventable lifestyle diseases and disorders. And that's tracked back to the mid-90s. So what I'm saying in total here is that for decades we've been improving the trend of people living longer. For decades people have been living longer because of advances, but that reversed in the mid-90s, and by the mid-2000s it was solid in science. So people are dying younger than they should with advances. There's a paradox, and we have to ask ourselves, how can that happen? It's contradictory. It doesn't work, but it is. And it's happening because of preventable stuff, preventable lifestyle diseases. So when we think of lifestyle, we think of food and diet and exercise, and stress management, and it's kind of a little category popped in there. But actually each one of those things is driven by mind. So we've got to relook at the whole concept. It's not that mind is just part of a list of things. Mind is driving all those things. Your mind never stops for 3 seconds. We can go without food for 3 weeks. We can go without water for 3 days. We can go without oxygen for 3 minutes. We don't even go 3 seconds without our mind working. Your mind is the source of everything. So your mind is the source of what you choose to eat and the nutritional benefit you get from what you're eating. You can lose up to 80% of the nutritional benefit just by being in a toxic, unforgiving, or bitter or angry state, which affects your pancreas, for example, and it doesn't secrete neuropeptides that you should have. And there's a whole bunch of stuff. So your mind is driving your digestive system. Your mind drives the benefit that you get down to the level of your DNA out of exercise. Your mind is driving how you manage that next argument, that next podcast, that next interaction, that response to the news. Your mind is always working. So if we don't deal with mind, or we eliminate mind and just try and label people from a symptom, we are going to land up with what we have, people dying younger than they should. And mankind advancing with technology, but going backwards with who we are as humans. And that's where we are currently. And then COVID hit. That was already happening. And then COVID hit.
Right.
And COVID is forcing us to, it has added to the problem, but it's also forcing us to shift. And it's going to bring us back to the 70s and 80s and 50s and 60s, where we started looking at the human again. So it's had a very negative effect and a very positive effect. And not many people talk about the positive effect. So in conclusion to that question, was a long answer. When you identify with, if someone says you have clinical depression from a list of symptoms, and they diagnose, so symptom, 15 minutes, diagnosis, label, medication, or maybe a bit of therapy, or maybe a bit of both, you immediately change the way that your brain functions. You start your frontal, I'm just going to give you simple versions. For example, your frontal lobe, as soon as you get that kind of negative label, you get less oxygen and blood flow to the front of your brain, literally immediately. Your identity gets stuck in being in a very negative identity. So that creates imbalance between the two sides of the brain. So identifying with a toxic label that doesn't actually make sense will affect the functionality of your ability to make decisions and think with cognitive flexibility, and right down to the level of impacting intelligence. And I show that in my research. When you actually show a person how to shift their identity and not see themselves as a label. So instead of saying, I am depressed, like that's me, I've got clinical depression. You rather say to help them to see, empower them to see that no, you aren't depression. You're experiencing depression, which is totally okay, totally understandable. And if you grab that depression and look at it, you'll find a message in the depression. You are simply responding in a normal way to an adverse circumstance. When you change that, you change everything about the brain, the body, right down to the level of the telomeres. So there's another long answer.
Yeah, so good. I'm loving this so much. And even just tickling with the telomeres there at the end is
Tickling with
so
the
good.
telomeres.
Now, now this is one of the most powerful things I've continued to reiterate for years, just because, again, the data exists. Every thought that we have creates correlating chemistry in our body.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about mind creates your brain, mind creates your body. And but with that said, one of the most powerful things that we do, but often unconsciously do, is we accept these labels. And
Yeah.
there's this, it's kind of a personal development statement, but there's science behind it. When you label me, you negate me,
Exactly.
right? When you label
Beautiful.
me, you negate me. And we literally are changed. And as you, by the way, if you guys aren't watching the video version and seeing Dr. Leaf picking up the brain and pointing to the different regions, make sure to check the video out. Super cute. That's a nice brain,
It
by
is
the
a
way.
nice brain. I
And
like it too. I have a few in here. And there's another one in here's a body with a brain. I love brains. They're all over my office.
she's got brains everywhere. So here's the thing, though, is that when we subscribe to a label, it's changing our chemistry, it's changing our biology. And so once we take that on, and by the way, the label, and I love the fact that you point to data. Like and I love this repeatedly. You just look at the results. We have more antidepressants and antipsychotics than ever before, yet they haven't reduced the prevalence
No.
of any of these mental health issues at
They've
all.
made them
Something is
worse.
clearly
They've
wrong.
made them worse.
Yeah.
We have a worse problem. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize. But
No,
we have
please.
a worse problem now than we had when in the late 80s, well, sort of mid 80s was when Prozac was released. And it was in the 50s that the first antipsychotic was discovered by mistake. They basically, all psychotropics are anesthetics. They're versions of anesthetics. So they basically numb the brain. So we're sitting now as part of the reason why people are dying 18 to 25 years younger. Part of it is not helping people manage mind, just stuffing down the symptoms with a drug. And those drugs change the brain. They're psychoactive, which means that they alter the brain chemistry and not in a good way. And yes, maybe someone is having a complete psychotic break and they're danger to themselves and they may need to be sedated for a 24-hour period or just for it, like you have surgery, you have an anesthetic. You have it for that need. But it's not, these drugs should not be used beyond a need. They're not fixing a problem. But what they've done is they've created a problem. So Sean, what we're sitting with now is not just the normal mental health issues that people just have. If you're a human and you're alive, your mind's a mess. That's why I called my book Cleaning Up the Mental Mess. So there's no one's exempt. We've got to stop thinking that mental health affects them and not me. If you're human, you're experiencing adversity, up and down, good and bad, you're in a mental mess a lot of your day and we need to manage it. So mental health, when it gets very extreme, then we go down to the psychotic breaks and the severe depressions. But those are still not illnesses. Those are just warning symptoms that something's going on, that we need to go and find out the story and help you to
Yeah.
reconceptualize that story. And that's what's so vital, that we don't keep thinking that there is that the drugs haven't worked. The current labeling, diagnosing, and drugging hasn't worked. The prevalence has increased. Suicide has increased. Death of despair has increased. Lack of increase in. We have a mismanagement of mental health, which has created a whole lot of new iatrogenic problems, which are damage to the brain from these drugs, which are then producing other illnesses, but they're not the person's pain. They actually damage to the brain, which is then called, and they can be healed. I'm just saying that up front. No one must just go off their drugs. So if anyone's listening to this and they're on any form of psychotropics, Sean and I are not saying, and I'm not saying as a doctor that you go straight. Do not, because your brain has adapted. So if you just stop, you will have severe withdrawal symptoms, and then your doctors will put you on higher doses and multiple drugs. You need to get with the doctor who understands how to withdraw. And there's many sites that you can go on, and I've got information on my website. And you need to taper slowly under medical supervision. That's so important, and I cannot stress that enough. I just wanted to throw that in
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. And also, of course, we want to make sure that the people that you're working with have the same goal as you, first and
Exactly.
foremost. Like let's get on the same page so we're going in the same direction. And something really powerful just came up is that truly the problem is that the problem is not a problem in the way that it's written
Very
for
good.
us, right? We
Very
think
good.
that these diagnoses, like there's something wrong with you, instead of understanding, no, this is a part
It's
of
normal.
the human experience. So
Exactly.
when I'm experiencing anxiety, it is literally it is feedback. It's giving me data that there's something that I need to address, rather than let's suppress that calling from our body. And by the way, before we even get into that deeper, you've said this multiple times, but I want to help people to understand a little bit deeper, because we tend to think mind and brain are the same thing. So can you reference that distinction for us?
So important to understand the mind brain difference. And it's very understandable that we don't understand it because mind is considered the hard question of science, and it's not the hard question of science. It's the most obvious question. And why? Because of the example I gave you earlier on. You don't even go 3 seconds without thinking. Your mind is always working, it works 24/7, and it's always on the go. So when you're awake, you have your conscious and your non-conscious mind working, and when you're asleep, you have your non-conscious mind working, and then also you have a subconscious mind. But before I touch those divisions, let's talk about then what is the brain. Well, the brain is not the mind. It's physical. It's a physical substance. So if I was holding a real human brain, or I had someone's brain who was sitting here and I took their brain out their head, which I would not do, and I was holding a brain in my hand that was real and alive, we could stare at that brain all day long, Sean. It would never do anything. So why do I say that? Because we're told in the media, through the from the doctors, a lot of the psychiatrists, that your brain produces your mind, that your brain's generating your thoughts, that your thoughts are coming from your brain. They're not at all. There's a whole different pathway. Your thoughts are not coming from your brain. Your thoughts are built into your brain, but by another force, and that's your mind. So your mind is separate from the brain, but inseparable. The mind has to have the physical brain to express itself. And the mind also needs the body. So the mind needs the brain and the body in order to express itself. In other words, to express you. So mind is a gravitational force. We can use quantum physics and classical physics to understand it. It's very complicated, but there's been Nobel Prize winning work done on the gravitational fields that we immersed in, and the gravitational fields inside of us, and the quantum fields and electromagnetic fields inside of us. So one of the easiest ways to understand the separation is to think back to school. When we were at school, when your kids are at school, and they gave us a piece of white paper, and then they put iron filings on it. Do you remember, like, having a piece of white paper with a bunch of iron and this blob of all these iron filings? Then you brought a magnet into the middle and you put it in, and suddenly the iron filings arrange themselves into these magnetic fields. Now, that is a great analogy for mind brain. Think of the brain as the magnet, and think of the mind as the iron filings, but also the iron filings are still substance. But think of the patterns, that what is causing the iron filings to go into those patterns. That's an electromagnetic force. That's what the mind is
Mm.
like. So the mind is influencing the iron filings. It's influencing, and the iron filings could be the you could see those as your thoughts that are inside the brain, and the magnet is the brain. So the physical has to get a reaction out of it, you need the mind. If you're dead, there's no mind, so there's no reaction in the brain. There's nothing happening in the body. But when you're alive, the patterns there, the electromagnetic forces are there. So you and I are generating electromagnetic fields as we speak. The words that I'm speaking are coming from thoughts that are physically built into my brain of all these years of research and everything I know about the field. And as we're conversing, what you know about the field is popping up from thoughts in your brain. But they didn't just get there. They weren't just there. You built them. So you as a human, you, Sean, went through life, and you went to school, and you went through life, and you got married and had kids, and you've run businesses. All of those are day-to-day experiences that you've processed through your mind, this force, and then it's been built, and then as that the life is experienced through the force, that gravitational field, and that then goes through your brain and is transformed into thoughts that look like trees. So right now, as you are listening to me at 400 billion actions per second, you and the listeners and viewers are taking my words. And if you're looking at these, if you're just listening, you're hearing, if you're listening and seeing, you've got sound waves and electromagnetic light waves. You're taking those, and what is you? You is mind. You are thinking, feeling, and choosing in response to what I'm saying. So mind, if you want a definition of mind, it's this gravitational field. That's the sciencey stuff, this quantum field. Psychologically, the mind is how you think, how you feel, and how you choose. So as you think, which you're always doing, you will always feel. You never think in isolation. As soon as you're thinking, you're feeling. And as soon as you're thinking and feeling, you're choosing. So it's think, feel, choose, think, feel, choose, think, feel, choose. We're doing that in cycles of like these sort of 5-step cycles on an unconscious level at 400 billion actions per second. And that's what you guys are doing right now. And that then generates this energy where through the brain, and the brain responds electromagnetically, chemically, neurochemically, and genetically, and on a quantum level. And genetically is kind of that switch that switches on and it creates. So you are when the gene is activated. So as you think, feel, choose, it whooshes through the brain, electromagnetic, chemical response, and then there's like the last response is genetic, and that genetic response then builds proteins, and the proteins look like they cluster together and make branches, and my words are vibrations in those proteins. At this point, you've grown about 200 branches, but you first grew roots. So as you introduced me, you sowed the seed that formed the roots of something about mind, brain, and our discussion, and the kids, and your daughter, so those are the roots. And as I'm speaking, I mean, as you were talking, and you grew a tree trunk, which is, oh, I'm going to learn about my mind, and then the branches are your behaviors and emotions related. So the roots, the origin story. And as we're talking, we're growing more roots. The tree trunk's getting thicker. We're adding more branches with the data and the emotions, more information, more thicker, a thicker tree trunk, increasing perspective, improving perspective. You're getting and more. And that's a thought. That's what you're doing at 400 billion actions, and that's in your brain. And we have trillions upon trillions upon trillions of these. And you never run out of space in the brain. These are dynamic. They're organic. They're always changing. So today we're having a discussion, and I have already learned new stuff about my own work. So this stuff came up, and I grew more information. You grew more information. You know about the brain, so do I. But this discussion is enriching so we're growing more branches. You learn to drive. You grow the roots, and you grow a thought of driving. Every time you get in the car, you grow more branches. It's experience. So your brain is constantly getting stuff built into it. So your brain is a responder, not a generator. And that's really what we need to see. It's a responder. So if it's damaged and not looked after, and this is really a huge part of what you do as well, you teach people how to, eat, and also you work on thinking and exercise healthy. I mean, I've got your book, which I'm interviewing you about soon. Really amazing stuff. I love your work. Really, I also love your work. You're teaching people to keep this organ healthy and this body healthy, because the mind has to use this to be able to work. So if it's not working very well, then we have this fogginess. We have like driving through snowstorm without windscreen wipers. So we're dealing with damaged goods. So you want your body and physical health. So you have to look after that. But that's a mind decision to look after that. So they can get your book, they can get my book, and it just sits on their shelf. Or you can actually study my book, study your stuff, and I teach you how to study it. There's a whole chapter on how can you get information in your head and apply it. That's a decision of your mind. Studying means I'm going to think, feel, and choose and learn this information and build trees in my brain of how to eat smarter, of how to clean up your mental mess. So everything's mind. So mind is that force that creates the iron filings, or it's the force that creates the memories in the brain, these protein trees in the brain. And Shauna does one more thing. It does a lot more things. But when you build a thought, not only do you build trees in your brain, but you also have 37 to 100 trillion cells in your brain and body. As you guys are listening to me now, you're building this tree in your brain, a thought could be, as I said, there's 200, 300, 400. By the end of this conversation, you'll have probably a couple of thousand branches and roots on this thought. So it's one thought made of multiple memories. Like a tree is made of branches, a thought is made of memories. So what's a memory? The branches on the thought. So each thought is a concept with multiple memories. So we build that in our brain, and that whole concept also goes into the DNA of every single cell. How that works, we're still trying to understand, but those tiny little DNA strands also store the thoughts. So whatever's in your brain is also in every cell of your body, which is phenomenal. And that is why
Wow.
we experience, like PTSD is the most obvious thing to recall, that a trauma happens and whatever, and you recall the trauma and it may be years later, but that trauma as it comes up, that trauma then you recall that whole sensation inside of your body. And that's because you are calling that it's the physical inside of your body. You can experience something and you could, let's say that you've been bullied by someone and that day you're very fluey, and now it's years later and you built a toxic thought. So got this little tree to show, it's the living dead. It's like Game of
Mm.
Thrones. It's the living dead. This is real, but it's toxic. And if you don't deal with it and you've suppressed it, this memory's in your brain and your body and your mind, three places. So it's in the gravitational field. So that's why you feel it and you experience this like a photon effect that Einstein spoke about. It's in your brain and it's in your body. So when you recall it, you're going to, the data comes back, the emotions come back, the feelings come back, the total narrative comes back through your mind. And that's why it's so overwhelming. And that's why these have to be suppressed these have to be dealt with, not suppressed, because they cause brain damage, like envy, jealousy that we spoke about in the beginning. So I hope that makes, I know it's hard to understand, but think of mind as physical. Just step out of the paradigm that you've had for years where mind and brain have been used interchangeably and see them as separate but inseparable. This thing can do nothing without your mind. Your mind is you, your unique thinking, feeling, choosing, which happens at 400 billion actions and faster on a non-conscious level. On a conscious level, it's at about 2,000 actions. We are aware of it every 10 seconds. So we can be aware of our mind, of how we're thinking and feeling and choosing every 10 seconds, which is how we learn to self-regulate. So I dropped
Ooh.
a loaded bomb there. You might
This
want to
is
unpack that.
it. If people get this, is one of the most important things that I've ever heard, but I feel like also hearing it for other people, for us to make this distinction, because as you
Yeah.
know, our system of, just assessment of humans, it's been very mechanistic,
Yes.
just Newtonian. Like I'm
Cartesian,
trying to
yeah.
find the brain. I mean, the mind must be here. It's the seat of the soul somewhere. But this is getting into a realm that might look a little spooky. But we've of course we got science to
Yeah.
kind of figure this out, because we always were chasing, trying to figure out how all this stuff works. But we do know, like you said, there's like a gravitational pull. There's a gravitational anomaly that we are. We're so much more than what we see when we
Exactly.
look in the mirror. That's the big thing. And what you just mentioned, as we're evolving in this time right now in human history, getting us back to, but I don't even like to say back to, but like forward
Yeah.
to a place where we are acknowledging all of it, right?
Yes.
Mind and brain.
Yes. We've got to bring
Yeah.
mind, brain, body into the equation, and we've got to understand the relationship. And this is something that you asked me. The first question was what got me into this. As I started understanding as a young student the power of knowing the difference between mind and brain and the relationship, that's why I chose to pursue this for 38 years. And this is what I've intensively and passionately studied in various different ways with humans. I've never done lab work. I don't do lab experiments because you're not going to get real. I work with humans in the field. And I come from Zimbabwe, born there, but I grew up in South Africa. So in the apartheid era. So I spent 3 days a week working in the areas that were the most affected by the apartheid era and then the transition and the post era, the socioeconomic, political. I've worked in war-torn Rwanda. I've worked with the wealthiest of the wealthy. I've worked with the poorest of the poor. I've worked in corporate education. Every field I could get into, I've got into and to work with humans to understand what is mind and what's into the integration and how can you understand it. And this book, really, Cleaning Up a Mental Mess, Sean, is really an accumulation or a sort of dissemination of all these years into simple language to help us to understand that. And the reason I put science in is because science is so spiritual, if I even may say that. Science is so, it changes all the time. It's never the same. And that's why we have to be continually learning. But science is a way of how we can actually then see, if I do this, this happens. And I think one of the key things in science with mind is understanding that when I think, feel, and choose in this way, it has consequence. I will build a thought in my brain. And that thought will also build in my body and in these gravitational fields on a subatomic level. And they're going to influence what I say and what I do. And I'm going to get feedback. And if it's toxic, it's going to damage the brain and body, which can be healed. But the brain and body, we see from neuroscience, is not wired for toxicity. So we're not wired for things like anger, jealousy, envy, all the toxic stuff you can think of. We're not wired for depression, frustration, irritation, anxiety. And that is why when we experience those, we mustn't try and push them away or feel bad about them. We need to actually use them to say, why am I doing that? We need to embrace them as messengers. Okay, I'm irritated. Why? I'm having an argument. Why? I'm depressed. Why? See them as helpful. Eastern philosophy's done this for years. They've seen that any negative emotion is something that's telling you a story. And I showed in my most recent research the same thing. When you see something toxic, not as something that you have to be frightened of, but as something that you should embrace to control, otherwise it controls you, you completely shift the power play. So if I say I'm depressed, I'm anxious, this is terrible, I don't know what to do, I'm so frustrated. As you do that, your brain and body and telomeres and everything, blood, homocysteine, inflammation, the whole lot's going crazy. But the minute I say, I feel depressed at the moment, I feel really bad, I'm having an awful day, but I can work out why, and I can manage it. You immediately shift the brain. Even feeling depression, with that attitude, you shift the brain and the body, and 1,400 neurophysiological responses will now work for you instead of against you. You know, I mean, this is profound. This is stuff we need to be teaching people. We need to understand this concept. Sorry, I get so passionate about this because it's so
No,
important.
do not apologize. This is the best. This is so good. You know, I just thought about something too. When we're not doing what you just mentioned, which is what our society has unfortunately kind of inundated us to do, when the experience of depression comes up and we don't address it, we become so distant from it. We don't even recognize it anymore. And we compensate, we continue to compensate. And now it's like, and this is what we're going to get into next, which is cleaning up this mental mess so we can get closer to seeing these feedbacks mechanisms from our body and our brain. Your mind creates your brain. And even right now, as we're doing this incredible podcast, everybody listening, we're growing new roots. We're creating roots. We're growing basically these branches of thought, of association. And it could be healthy, or as you gave the Game of Thrones reference, it could be a White Walker type of branches. Or you can get some nice, handsome Jon Snow branches
Exactly.
going, either way. But we have to clean up our mental mess. And I'm going to share this directly from your book because I want to start with this. You said that so much in our society seems to convey the message of now. It's as if we've entered an era where we have sacrificed the processing of knowledge for the gathering up of data. All right. So now I want to really be clear about this because this was one of those moments when I was reading this and it really struck me, especially we got social media, we've got the internet, we have so much data at our fingertips, but I've rarely seen a person, especially in the context of an argument, sitting with the idea, really allowing that to play out and to process it and to think about different angles of it, think it where it might not be true, and allowing that to really become a basis of knowledge. Because right now we're gathering so much data, but we're starving for knowledge. So let's start with
I
that.
love that. It's one of my favorite things to talk about as well. Although I love talking about all this stuff. It's so true. We're brilliant. Okay. But bottom line, humans are phenomenal. We have this endless capacity in our mind, in our non-conscious mind, which is working 24/7, which is infinite. It's like this massive forest. If you had to visualize flying over a forest with a helicopter, and it's just endless. That we have this infinite capacity to build, to respond to everything we're seeing and hearing, and build it in our brain. So we're going to do that, and we do select. Our brain is also very it's trained to be selective, but our brain can't select. Our brain is designed, its mechanisms are selective, but it has to be driven by something to be selective. So we mustn't personalize the brain, because the brain can't do anything without you. Okay, so with your thinking, feeling, and choosing, so which is your mind. So with all this ability to look and hear and see, like you've described, we are taking that and we are growing data banks in our brain, and they're going into this non-conscious mind. So this forest analogy has got a lot of a whole big sections of little trees that are light green, but they're just sitting there. They're just like fillers. You could even see them as almost moss on the ground if you wanted to have an analogy. But I can't really use the information in them because they're so far away and they're so inaccessible. They're this really inaccessible, almost like inside an oyster shell. So it's there, but I can't access it because I haven't put it into the ground properly. It's not something that's user friendly. Maybe it's even the rocks on the ground could be a good analogy. It's there, it's in the forest, but it's not accessible. And so we know we heard that and we know we read that and we know something about that, but we haven't. And that creates a lot of mess. Actually, rocks is a good analogy because now we've got this mess and these little trees that's of some that we spent a bit of time. And that's not the natural design. The natural design of our forest should be this plush, rich, beautiful trees like in San Fran, the redwoods, think of those trees and that incredible root system. That's what we designed for. We designed for deep intellectual thought. We designed for that redwoods forest where their root system is extensive, and all systems are, but the redwoods are known for their hugeness and their plushness and the root systems that are phenomenal and massive. That is what the human brain looks like. Inside we have redwoods that we're supposed to have, and our mind also has this redwood nature where if that makes sense. But we're not always thinking deeply enough. So instead of building these beautiful lush trees, our conversation now is building a beautiful lush tree. But if we just kind of skim the surface, we would just build a little tiny kind of tree that might just disintegrate and have a whole bunch of rocks and stuff covering it. So that's what's happening. And that causes in the brain, that looks like these still protein branches, but the proteins don't form in a very sustainable way. So if you don't do something with that information, energy is never lost. And this is all energy inside the protein. Energy is never lost. It's vibrational energy. It's transferred. It's converted. So if you don't pay any more attention to something, you just gather the data, it's going to convert into heat energy and disappear. So in your forest, there's these little trees and these rocks and these puffs of smoke all over the place. That is the information you've gathered that just, it's gone out of your head. It's converted. And that's terrible if it's something you need. But if you take the time to think and feel and choose in a very systematically mind-driven, mind-managed way, you will actually grow a tree that gets roots and actually starts being, maybe it's a little bit light green and small, but then over time it becomes this lush redwood type tree. As soon as it's that kind of tree in the gravitational fields, it's also going to be that kind of tree in the brain, and that's the kind of tree that influences behavior. So if you want a behavior change in your life, if you want to be able to have an intelligent discussion about something or be a contributor, or, when you think of someone who's wise, it's someone who's well read and who's thought about it, and they can contribute wisdom to a conversation. They tend to be the ones that are, maybe not always the calmer ones, but the ones that can kind of see two sides of the coin, that agree to disagree, that can, and I don't want to use politics, but there's certainly, you can see this in, I'm not going to mention names, but you can see this in certain politicians very easily. The ones that are using wise minds and the ones that are just spouting out all kinds of stuff. And, that's just all around us now. So I use that example, but we do that in our own lives. We're all guilty of that too. So that's what is very damaging for the brain, because that dirt, those little trees that you don't build that keep making puffs of smoke, that's in the gravitational fields of the mind. It creates a disruption in energy. So the non-conscious level, in the gravitational fields, in that third sort of level, they're those that makes little balls of energy rolling through the forest. I'm giving as many visuals, and those are like, especially where there's a lot of toxicity or unprocessed stuff. Both areas will produce unbalanced energy, and that makes us feel uncomfortable. We feel something's wrong, and you can actually even feel a
Yeah.
little bit depressed and anxious, and from not
Yeah.
learning properly. And that's not even, I haven't even touched on the toxicity side. So what we want to do is deal with that through deep level mind brain building. I have a whole section in the book called Brain Building, where I teach you how to not let that happen, because it's actually dangerous. It affects, you talk about helping people sleep, and you've actually written a book about sleep. One of the biggest causes of people not sleeping is not thinking deeply enough to build redwoods and having too many of these little things and dirt, and it creates toxicity in the
Mm.
brain. So when you're sleeping at night, your brain's housekeeping. So if you've got a lot of the stuff, it gets rid of it. It tries to get rid of it. And if you haven't used the neurogenesis you mentioned, every day you're born with, when you wake up, a whole lot, thousands, maybe even millions, we're still doing the research, of new cells are born in your brain. They are designed for a very specific purpose. They're designed to be used with deep intellectual thinking. not just gathering of data, but gather the data, select the data, think it through deeply, build it into your brain. You can't, not everything, choose something. When you do that, you're going to grow that redwood type forest. You're going to use those new baby nerve cells and you're going to create this brain resilience system in your brain. So learning new information and deep thinking creates brain health. It creates brain resilience so that you're stronger for the acute traumas that hit us, like things like COVID, like the phone call that happens, like the thing in your business. Every day there's something that happens that we can't predict. And sometimes it's worse and sometimes it's not so good. If you don't have good brain resilience, that's a problem. So this gathering of data in our current now moment technological age creates these patterns of damage in the brain. So literally causing brain damage, and it will come out in your sleep is one of the first strong signs, and also in how you actually just managing through the day. There's a constant feeling of, I just am not getting this right, this living right. All my patients, Sean, whenever a patient came into my clinical practice, and I practiced for 25 years, as I mentioned, the first thing I would do would be teach them brain building, which is the first. In the second half of the book, it's all I talk about the neurocycle, which I know you're going to ask me about, but it's the second half of the book's practical. And the first section teaches you how to brain build. And as humans, we should be like, you clean your teeth every day, twice a day, sometimes 3 times a day. You should brain build for at least 1 to 2 hours every day to keep your brain healthy. It's one of the best ways of improving mental health and creating the resilience we need just to be humans, to manage our mind. So there's a little passionate answer again.
Yeah, you've literally helped me so much by this is one of those things where you're bringing out something that's just like it's lingering there in my psychology, but I never put words to it. A big part of our epidemic of mental health struggles is related to our inability to think deeply.
Exactly.
And
Huge.
wow, that is like
Huge.
an absolute that just cracked me wide open because as you mentioned, this capacity. Wait, so first of all, a lot of us are walking around with a lot of rocks just rattling around in our head,
Exactly.
and we're wondering why we can't sleep at night.
Yeah.
It's just like it's a rattle just going
Hmm.
around. We haven't really created a situation where it's a beautifully landscaped, cultivated. Our brains
Exactly.
as humans, we've evolved to spend time
It's
thinking,
survival.
thinking
It's a
deeply.
survival
It's
instinct.
right. Right. And now today we're just grabbing snacks everywhere. We're
Exactly.
grabbing brain snacks and not really nourishing our brain through thought.
Exactly.
I'm done. This is goodness
And that's
gracious.
contributing to this epidemic of people dying 8 to 25 years younger. And the research shows that you give someone a label. I mean, this is coming full circle back to our earlier discussion. You label someone, you literally can add on another 10, you can chop off another up to 20 years of a person's life. That's unbelievable. I saw in my research that those patients that came in the experimental and control group, the subjects that came in with so-called diagnosed clinical depression, they had such low energy in the front of their brain. They were identifying as a depressed person. And through mind management, through the neurocycle, we were able to help them shift that. But here's the interesting thing, Sean. The shift happens on a non-conscious level in the forest, that non-conscious forest that I spoke about, the gravitational fields, that concept, the ion filings, that level, and also it's in the brain. So in the actual physical brain. So the non, but you don't consciously. I guess let me say it this way: your conscious mind is always way behind your non-conscious mind and what's happening in your brain. Your brain picks up immediately what's happening in the non-conscious mind. The non-conscious mind is where the truth is, where what's really going on in your life is happening. So we can be in a state of denial, which most of us do with certain things in our life. We've all got, and it's nothing to feel guilty about. This is the freedom in my message. Embrace it all because everything's a message. So if you are feeling guilty, grab the guilt, find the reason, do the apologizing, and move on. Don't ever let shame stop you and block you. But whatever you've got in your life is going to affect how your identity is going to function. It's going to like kind of block that. So what we saw happening was that if you from here, I give you the science and the evidence that in my clinical trials, and there's summary there, that your non-conscious mind is already healing before you feel it. So if you go through the process of, for example, using the neurocycle, which is it's everyone should be using it. It's pure mind management. It doesn't mean you stop the therapy. You still do that. It enhances therapy. This is what do you do with yourself 24/7. That's what I'm teaching people to do. What do? You got to live with yourself. How do you live with yourself? That's what I'm showing you here. So as you direct your mind and you manage your mind, your non-conscious and your brain will change before you'll feel it. And I've got beautiful little pictures in color in the book to show you that change that's happening. So I encourage people that in the first 3 weeks of making changes, you very often won't feel massive change or see massive change, but it is happening. The evidence is there. Your non-conscious mind is changing, your brain is changing. And that helps us to recognize my mind's doing this work. My conscious mind, I'll catch up. Eventually, I'm going to catch up with what's really going on inside of me.
Yeah, I love it. Let's do that. Let's talk about the neurocycle a little bit. Just give people an overview
Absolutely.
of what that
Absolutely,
looks
with
like. Yeah.
pleasure. So the neurocycle is 38 years in the making. So the first version was developed 38 years ago to meet the needs of 38 years ago to meet the needs of my patients, to give them something that could help them deal with that trauma, that learning problem, whatever. And I was so disillusioned by the therapy techniques that I had been trained to use in my practice. Not all of them were bad. A lot of them had great principles, but there was something missing, and that something that was missing was the ability for me to control my mind. So what I wanted to do was to say, okay, there's all these beautiful techniques and therapies and wonderful stuff, but no one's showing me how to actually learn them and use them in my life. So there's a whole missing element. It's kind of like the rocks in the trees. If you just read the stuff but you don't actually learn how to use the stuff, you've got to. So what is that? What is that? How do I learn how to take the data that's coming in, choose something, and think about it deeply to build it into a thought in my brain? How do I do that? That's what the neurocycle is. That's what I developed 38 years ago. I developed the vehicle, the system for how you as a human can get hold of your mind. How do I get hold of my thinking, feeling, and choosing to catch these thoughts, these toxic ones, these patterns, these bad habits, these traumas, these things, these responses that are getting me stuck and making me, that I'm ruminating and my mind's going crazy and I hate responding like this, but I'm responding. How do you get that under control? And how do you build your brain? All that stuff. That's what the neurocycle is. So it's 5 simple steps, because if you're working with someone who's in trauma, you can't give them 5 hours of explanations. So I had to refine, I had to go through a process of understanding and refining. So I've taken okay, backtrack for a second. In the process, I studied the science of how thoughts form in the brain from the mind. So what is the mind? Developed a theory of mind, and then how do they grow into the brain? What's the process? How do they grow into the mind, and how do they grow into the DNA? How do they get there? And can I influence that? Can I control it? Yes. So the 5 steps are how you use your mind to grow these in your brain and in your mind and in your forest, in your DNA, sorry, and how to control it. So that's what the neurocycle is. 5 steps that are based on solid science. So each step, and in the book, I do explain the 5 steps and I do give the science behind them. And if people want to read the science, they can skip it or they can read it. But there's an explanation of what each step is doing in the brain. So what I can do, if you want, Sean, is I can give a broad overview of the concept with a simple explanation, just a couple of brain and body things. And then people can read more,
Perfect.
and then we
Yes.
can maybe do an example or whatever you want from there. If you,
That sounds
okay,
perfect.
perfect.
Let's do that.
Okay, so the first thing is that you have to prepare your brain. And that's something we're all familiar with, priming our brain or preparing our brain preparation. And that's not one of the steps, that's just preparation. So what are those things? Everything that we're familiar with: breathing, tapping, havening, meditation, you name it. Anything that you can start getting your neurophysiology calmed down. Because when we are busy, 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 hurry sickness, or experiencing frustration, or dealing with a trauma, or in a life, okay, we get worked up. So what we want to do is, before we do the work of cleaning up the mental mess, it's very important to prepare the brain. Obviously, involved in all of that is diet and exercise, etc. But those are big picture things. So in this moment right now, let's say that you have an argument with someone, and you've got to get your head together, and you've got to get into a TV interview, or you've got to get on a stage, or you've got to go into a business meeting, or you've got to have dinner with your in-laws. I don't know what it is, but you've just had a thing that's disrupted your life for a few moments. How are you going to get yourself back together again? We can take that as one example, and then we can take another example of, let's say that you were abused as a child and you've never dealt with it, and now you're an adult and your relationships are just messed up, and you realize that you're depressed and you're trying to find out why. And so, in other words, sexual trauma can be pervasive. So that's a big thing. So I'll approach the 5 steps from those two angles. One, how can I use it in the now? And I call that basically a neurocycle life hack. And another example would be people pleasing or responding. Someone says something toxic to you, or you find yourself ruminating, or so it's interactions and it's in your own head. You might find that you just can't get your thoughts under control and you keep ruminating and it's affecting how you're working and so on. The other thing is the more long-term stuff, like a toxic trauma or a toxic bad habit. Maybe you've got a really toxic habit that is keeping you stuck. So those are a little bit different. Both use the 5 steps, but they use them. One, you'll use them in 5 minutes or 5 seconds. The other one you do for 15 to 45 minutes every day for 21 days. And then you're not finished, because then you've built a tree, but it's small. You have to grow it and give it energy, for to water it. You have to spend another 42 days of doing the 5th step, which takes you about a minute a day for 42 days. So it's very little time, but it grows that tree into a redwood. It gives it enough energy that it will impact your behavior. So if you're in that relationship issue, or you're in that argument that you've had repeatedly with the same person, it's the same pattern, as having done this work of over 42 days, as the trigger occurs, this will pop up, because this has been destroyed and you've reconceptualized it. You'll remember this, and you'll remember, oh, I used to, and you might even start reacting in that way, but this is not no energy anymore. This one dominates, and so you'll have behavior change. Or you're in that relationship and that sexual trauma maybe has pervaded your ability to, you're totally anxious and you can't form relationships, you just lost hope, you're gonna whatever, but you work through this process and it may take a few cycles of 63 days. What would that look like at the end? What that would look like at the end is, yes, I went through trauma. It affected me. This is why I'm feeling anxious. But now I know why, and now I know how to manage the anxiety, and I can explain that in my relationship, and I can now work on another neurocycle to work out how I can actually improve the relationship, because maybe your relationships are on the rocks because of that. So you've got to, can you see what I'm saying? So we give up too quickly. We do something, so people will do these 5 steps and think, I've done it once, why is my life not changed? Or people go to therapy, and
Right.
you have to persist and push through. It takes 63 days to form a habit. It does not take 21. It takes 21 days to create the neuroplastic changes in the brain, where you have found this, pulled it apart, embraced, processed, and reconceptualized it to deconstruct and reconstruct it into a healthy thought. Reconceptualize. You remember the past, but it's reconceptualized. It takes 21 days to do that, but it takes 42 days to give the sufficient energy to move out of the non-conscious into the conscious. It's like when you drive. At first, you're very conscious of the process, and then comes a day like now, you don't think about driving, and we think we're driving automatically, but we're not at all. There's a huge dynamic intelligence occurring. You get in that car, you pull up your driving thought from your non-conscious mind. It's intelligent, and you add new branches because you're driving. It's a new experience. So that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so prime the brain and prepare the brain, because otherwise we have neurochemical chaos. When the brain's got a lot of chemistry flying around and energy going crazy, it's very hard to get anything in here properly. So we just want a little bit of breathing can reset the brain. And one of the most powerful techniques, and I teach you quite a few, and I mean, it's easy to find preparation. I do give lots of examples. We have an app, by the way, that also goes with this, called the Neurocycle app. And there's lots of, I walk you through this process, obviously, like therapy. It's like literally therapy, videos, audio. So an example of brain preparation that you could do in 60 seconds that is phenomenally powerful is what I call the 10-second pause. And this is how you do it. So this is now the preparation, okay? So we're going to now do a neurocycle, but before we start, we're going to prepare our brain. And the 10-second pause is you breathe in for 3 counts and you breathe out for 7. The reason the exhalation is longer than the inhalation is because that pushes oxygen to the front of the brain, increases blood flow, increases what we call the alpha energy of the brain and the gamma energy in a balanced way, which means I'm now going to be insightful and integrative in my thinking, which is exactly what we want. We want deep introspection, insight, and we want to integrate. That keeps us in perspective. People that argue and say, this is my way or the highway, that kind of, who can't tolerate other people's opinions or don't know how to disagree, they have got very low energy, low gamma, low alpha at the front of their brain. They've got brain fog, okay? But when you let that fog drop back, you can actually then learn how to actually agree to disagree and still like the person and not cut them, that kind of thing. So that's one of the benefits. So this breathing, you want to increase your activity in the front of the brain. So that's why you breathe out for longer than in. If you do this, it takes 10 seconds, 3 in, 7 out. If you do this 6 to 9 times, which is 60 to 90 seconds, you would have stabilized the neurochemistry in the brain and pushed enough blood and oxygen to the front of the brain and got this balance of what we call the alpha wave, the gamma wave, also the correct burst of what we call high beta and delta, and that things are doing what they should be doing. You've prepared, you've laid the table, you're ready to eat. Okay. So another component that even makes it more effective is you add 3 words to the 10-second pause. And those 3 words are, as you breathe in for 3, in your head, you say, in your mind, you say, think, feel. So it's you're breathing in, it's 3 counts, and it's think, feel. So you're adding words, you're adding a cognitive component. So it's not just one, two, you can do it with your fingers. So like that as you breathe in, but you're saying think, feel. You can even say it out loud, but you're adding a cognitive component to it. And then when you breathe out, you say choose. Anyone who does yoga knows about ocean breath, how you push the breath out. That's kind of what you're doing. You want to push that out. So it's a deep inhalation. It's not just a surface one, it's a deep belly breathing, blowing up like blowing up a balloon into your chest, into your head, and then whoosh it out. That kind of breathing 6 to 9 times is phenomenal at priming the brain. Sidebar, it's fantastic if you're in an argument or you've just got to calm yourself down quickly or you've got to get yourself back together it's great stabilizer. Okay, so these
you just have to train yourself to be able to access that in
exactly,
that
exactly.
moment.
And you don't
Yeah.
even, that's why I say you can just, for a moment, you can just say, give me a moment. I'm just going to process this. And we should all be doing that anyway. We shouldn't be reacting and firing back. We should always wait 60 to 90 seconds before we respond in a highly heated situation because we're going to say the wrong thing. In that 60 to 90 seconds, we are going to say the wrong thing because there's too much chaos in our brain. We don't have enough balance. So our mind is worked up and our brain is getting this whooshy energy through the brain, so it's all messed up. So you're not going to react well. I talk about that in the book as well. That's describe what I've just, and there's a bunch of other neuroplasticity techniques that you can use to help prime the brain.
Perfect.
Okay, so now let's start neurocycling. So now the first thing is you gather awareness. I spent a lot of time choosing the words that I use because I wanted to convey the concepts. We spoke earlier on about we shouldn't be frightened of things like depression and anxiety and anger and guilt. And yes, those are toxic. But if you're frightened of them, you make your brain more toxic. You create more damage in your brain. But if you say, okay, I know that they're a problem, but they aren't an it, they are a response to something that's going on. They're a symptom of an underlying cause. They're a warning signal like your alarm goes off. So if you see them in that way, a study came out of Japan and Tokyo just recently, Japan and Texas University, which confirmed the research I had shown 18 sort of a year ago, which is in the book, saying that if you do what I've just said, if you embrace, if you gather awareness, and see the message and see it for what it is, there's a message in it instead of trying to push it away and oh, this is terrible, I must get rid of it, this is a symptom, I must just get it, I must just push it away, I mustn't do this, I mustn't do this. You get the white bear effect. Tell yourself not to do something, you're going to do it. Okay, so you don't do that. You don't tell yourself don't do this. You rather say, why am I doing it? So you never say to yourself, let's say that you get mad in traffic, I mustn't do this. That will guarantee you will do it. But if you say, why am I doing this? Why am I getting so worked up? Okay, there's a message in this. There's something good about this. That heals the brain. So gathering awareness of that in that way heals the brain versus if I mustn't do this, I mustn't do this, I'm so bad. Can you see the difference? That one, the second one is causing brain damage. The first one where you're gathering, it's the gathering awareness is it's very positive. It's hopeful. It's okay. I'm messing up. Sure. I said the wrong thing. I was awful, but it's okay. I'm going to fix this because there's a reason why I'm doing that. Can you just feel how much calmer you feel just hearing me say that?
Right.
There's
Yeah.
like it takes away it makes you not feel defensive. You don't feel like you have to justify. You don't feel like you have to hide or withdraw. You actually can go forward into this thing. Okay, I just messed up. It's okay. I'm going to fix this. There's a why behind why I did this. That's what gathering is. You gather awareness. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? It's the attitude of I'm going to gather this. Think of an apple tree that's full of apples. And you sit under this apple tree and you just bump it, and all these apples land on your head and nearly knock you out. That's what we're doing when we go, oh, this is terrible. Everything's hitting you and you're confused and it's sore. Or you can say, okay, that's a really full apple tree. There's a lot of emotional stuff going on there. There's a lot of physical warning
Mm.
signals. But you know what? There's a reason. There's a root. There's a tree. There's a core. Okay, I'm going to go up and I'm going to pick the apples. and I'm going to put them in a basket. I'm going to gather awareness. See, there's such a difference. So that's what the first
I
step is
love
doing,
that.
and it does all this beautiful stuff in the brain, balancing the hemispheres, getting the blood flow in your telomeres. Your telomeres. Now, what is a telomere? We talked about, I love the way you said tickling telomeres earlier on. Your telomeres, DNA strand, for those of you that don't know, pull out the DNA, the chromosome out the DNA strand, it looks like an X. And where you see my fingernails, which are conveniently pink today, so it's easy to visualize this, you are telomeres. So telomeres do a lot of things, but one of their main jobs we're seeing in current research on mind-brain work is that they show what's going on in your mind and the impact of mind on body. So we're seeing them as a tremendous link between the two. There's been quite a lot of research, but not that much research done. It's very new research. And so I decided to start doing some of my own research and I put this information in the book. Now, normally what happens is that every second you're making millions of new cells. And the quality of those cells determines the quality of everything in your body and your brain. So if I am in a worked up state and I'm not managing my mind, for 10 minutes. How many seconds have passed in 10 minutes? Let's just take 1 minute, I'm worked up. 60 seconds have passed. Every second I've made millions of cells. I've just made 60 million bad cells. How did those bad cells translate? Vulnerability in my body. My body's not going to be as healthy in that moment. And there's a while before I turn those cells over again. So here's a very simple but very complex example of mind brain. Where do telomeres come in? They influence cell division. So if they are not strong and healthy, if they're short and like a worn, they're wearing out and they're not working well, you're going to produce unhealthy cells. And so we saw, for example, in my study with our subjects at the beginning of the study, we looked at psychology and narrative and blood and brain and all kinds of stuff. We saw that their telomeres, because they all came in with big things, clinical depression, traumas, lots of stuff. We saw that the telomeres were weak. They were shortened. We look at telomere length, you look at the quality, etc., through the testing. And their telomeres were short, which meant that they were biologically not that healthy. So cells translate into biology. So a simple example here is that some of them were like, let's say they were 30, but they had bodies because of their mind management and telomeres. They had bodies that were actually 30 to 40 years older and unhealthy than what they were. So we have a 30-year-old with a 65-year-old body that's sick. That person, if you're 30 and you have a 65-year-old sickly body, you have increased your vulnerability to disease by 75 to 98%, which is insane. And when you're in that state, I mean, there's so many things I can tell you, but when you're in that state, you'll start saying things like, I. You become very self-focused, and there's self-focus with the idea of improving, and there's self-focus with the idea of being stuck. If you I, me, I stuck, you actually can increase your chance of cardiovascular disease by 42% in the next 12 months. I mean, I can go on and on and on, and they're scary statistics, but you can reverse it just as quickly. So we showed that within 3 weeks, you can start improving the length of the telomeres by 9 weeks, and that's why 9 weeks is so critical. By 9 weeks, we had significantly lengthened the telomeres in the subjects. They had.
Incredible.
We didn't do it. They were doing it. How? Through the neurocycle. I didn't do drugs. I mean, didn't get they got no medications. They got no. We didn't even look at diet, etc. Which obviously it's important, but I just wanted to show the power of mind. So to pure
Right.
mind management, we brought their biological and chronological ages together. So that 30-year-old no longer had a 65-year-old sickly body after 9 weeks. 9 weeks, it's nothing. That's no time. They
That's
had their own
unbelievable.
30-year-old body. Their homocysteine levels had significantly dropped, which meant the inflammation through the brain and body had dropped. And you and I know inflammation that stays there longer than it should is going to increase your susceptibility to disease.
Right.
That's why people are dying from preventable lifestyle diseases. I'm giving you the keys of how to get into this preventable state proactively.
But this is priceless because people you're literally talking about our telomeres are a biological marker for aging,
Exactly.
and as a reference point, and people that were spending all of this money for anti-aging cream and anti-aging this and that, when our mind has the power that supersedes all
All
of that.
of it.
So powerful. So gathering,
Awareness,
that's number
gathering
one.
awareness. And there's some a simple version of, okay, so just to gather these just to help people, what do I gather awareness of? What are the apples I pick? You pick the emotional warning signals, anxiety, depression, whatever emotion. You pick the physical warning signals, what's going on in your body from the DNA. So what are you feeling? Heart palpitations, GI symptoms, stress in your shoulders, whatever. And then you also look at your behavioral warning signals. What are you doing? What are you saying? What's your body language? What words are you using? What are your behaviors? What are how people are responding? What are you doing at work? So you look at all those signals, and then you also look at your perspective. Very important. The perspective is the tree trunk. This perspective would be a life sucks perspective. This one is, okay, I've got hope. So perspective is kind of
Yeah.
the overarching view that you have when you're in that particular state. Okay, so that's what you gather awareness of. And you don't,
So with the so gather so there's 5 steps to this
yeah,
neurocycle. Is that
there's
correct?
5 steps.
So we'll bullet point the rest of them. I want everybody to get the book and start to put this stuff into action for themselves. So gather is number
Okay, that's
1.
number one.
So what
Number two
is
is reflect. Reflect. And if you think of reflect, a mirror reflects, light reflects. If you put light through a prism, it reflects multiple colors. It breaks up. So reflect is very big. It's this huge, complex reflecting on. It's ask, answer, discuss. So second step is reflect. How? Ask, answer, discuss. As you ask yourself, and you're having this discussion with yourself, as you ask yourself, you answer yourself, and you discuss with yourself. I feel depressed because of XYZ. Why? Because of XYZ. Why? Because of XYZ. And you keep, oh, that means this means, and you have this whole, and you can literally go into what I call the multiple perspective advantage, which I also teach in this book, which is creating space. It's standing back and observing yourself. So here I am, Caroline, mental mess, Caroline, wise. Pick the apples. Caroline, what apples are you picking? Caroline, now reflect, ask. So you almost do it in this creating mental space, which does the most fantastic stuff in your brain and body. And I don't want to belabor the point, but your telomeres are going to love it. Your homocysteine levels are going to love it. You're going to drop your cortisol levels, and you're going to increase your DHEA levels, which is really good. You want a great cortisol DHEA ratio. I can go on and on. You even drop prolactin. Prolactin is a hormone we normally associate with breastfeeding women, but it's a hormone in males and females. And there's a lot of new research coming out showing prolactin is also related to how we're managing our mind. So we saw prolactin dropping. Anyway, I can go on and on. But the point here, you get the general gist, is when you reflect in this way and you gather in this way, when you do these steps, you are literally changing the physiology, the neurophysiology. You're taking broken neurophysiology, you're taking literal broken stuff, and you are changing the wiring. So as you gather awareness, the minute you gather awareness, the little protein bonds holding this toxic thought with all of its data and roots and the whole thing, you're actually weakening the bonds, which makes it malleable, which makes it changeable. As you reflect, you weaken it even more. You're removing energy, and you're starting to gather that, transfer the energy into building a replacement. By the time you get to step 3, which is write, the famous write, everyone tells you to write, and you shouldn't write before you have gathered and reflected. There's a reason, and I put it in the book, there's very clear brain reasons. You've got to gather. And in that way, prime the brain. And I gave you an example, breathing. Gather, apple picking, the 4 things. Reflect, that deep ask, answer, discuss. Then you write. When you write, you pour your brain on paper, vomit the words on paper. You're putting your mind and brain on paper. You're pulling out the forest. And if you write in a way, and I've developed a system called the Metacog, which is in the book. I've also in the Neurocycle app that you can get as well. There's a whole video on how to do it. It is the most powerful way. I had patients in my clinic that were when I was practicing that were diagnosed with severe schizophrenia. Now, I don't believe schizophrenia is an it. It was a symptom. So I approached it as I've already explained. So that was a symptom of something going on. But they were so traumatized that they had multiple different personalities, and which is very often a mind manifestation of extreme trauma. And they had been for every therapy under the sun, and I taught them the neurocycle. And what we did was we used a massive big whiteboard, and we would take a concept, and I would say, okay, now start, gather awareness, reflect, and on a specific aspect, now write in the Metacog. And as they were writing, and this is an extreme example, but it's so powerful. As they were writing, we could see the personality split. We could see, so they were just talking as though it was one conversation. At the end of it, we could see 5 different people seeing this particular incident. And they stood back and they said, I didn't know. And that was when we were able to start recombining the elements of their mind and start dealing with the trauma. Because mind splits and we have psychotic breaks and disassociation when the trauma gets too much. It's pure survival. It's a pure survival mechanism. So to reconnect the mind, there's just an extreme example, but it could be something as simple as you have the same argument with your spouse, which is so common and you don't see it. You do this, gather, reflect, and write to the metacog, you will be stunned at what you see because you're pulling stuff out of the depths of your brain. You're forcing the two sides of the brain to work together. You're digging in that forest and you're literally going into the forest and you're digging up the tree and you're upending it and you're looking for those. The metacog as the third step is helping you. So you can see each of these is very scientific, very systematic. Your fourth step is the recheck, where you go and look at what you've written, because that metacog, I can guarantee, is a big mess. And that's what you want. It doesn't have to make any sense. You just get it out. The recheck is where you make sense. And you look back, okay, what is this? What am I saying? What is that? Patterns, triggers, activators, use colors, circles, draw pictures, arrows. Phenomenally powerful experience where you do a mental autopsy to reorganize, where you're digging around and finding where's the tumor. Oh, there it is. I can get it out. What's my antidote for the tumor? There's my trigger. There's my activator. There's the root. You start seeing the root. You start digging, the ground is being dug away and you can start seeing the roots coming up. So you're literally there with a spade in the recheck, digging the sand around the roots and digging up the tree, and you're pulling it up and you're starting to see that root and that root. It takes a full 21 days to get the roots out. You're not going to get the roots out on day one, but the recheck is each of the steps is taking in that direction. The active reach then is, at this stage, you've done a lot of work. Mentally, you can carry on. Physically, your brain can't. Okay, so a wise mind can carry on forever, but our mind that is the outside of the forest is the sort of the active mind that's going on all the time. It gets tired. The brain gets tired. So you have to finish. Active reach is your conclusion step for the day. So you would have done this process over 15 to 45 minutes max, and then you stop with your active reach, which could be anything from a simple statement, an action, something like, each time when I catch myself wanting to snap, maybe that's what you're working on, a pattern in a relationship, I am going to say X, or I am going to squeeze a stress ball, or I am going to visualize something, or sing the song in my head, or make a statement. Someone with sexual trauma, maybe they'll say something like, the first day they discover, okay, this is definitely something going on. And I feel shame. That's the big dominate. I am not shame. So that active reach, you literally practice. You practice saying it 7 times at least during the day. How? In the Neurocycle app, there is an active reach reminder. Like on your iPhone, you can put in your reminders. You set it to pop up on your computer. So if you're using the phone or if you're using the Neurocycle app, you can actually put the reminder in, and then it pops up. And then you'll read that. All you do is read it. It keeps it in your conscious awareness, giving it more energy. And it's positive. It's healthy. It's anchoring you back in mental peace. And that's so important to do that. So it's an action, but it's an action that leads you to progress forward in hope. So it's a beautiful thing as well.
Yeah.
And it's doing beautiful stuff in your brain. I can go on for hours and hours about that. But that's the essential concept. And the how to apply all of that, I've broken up into different sections. So the first section is brain building. So those same 5 steps you use to brain build. So that's learning. So this is great for parents of homeschooling. It'll help your kids learn how to learn, because that's what the brain building does. And then you as an adult and whatever, everyone should brain build. So it's basically the same 5 steps where the gather becomes gathering what you're learning. So reading, and the reflect is understanding what you've read, and the write is writing it down on the metacog. So it's the same process, but it's just done as a building versus a detoxing. So the one you're detoxing and rebuilding, the other one you're actually building something in your brain. Same 5 steps. I've also got in here how to deal with trauma, acute trauma, which is the sudden stuff, the big T trauma, which is those things like war and rape and that sort of stuff. And then there's the small T trauma, which is equally as damaging, but it's the little things that happen every day. Like maybe you have a boss at work who's constantly on your back, or you have a sick family member and it's just constant little traumas, how to work with those. I also have a section in here on how to deal with toxic habits. Like if you keep arguing with your spouse, there's a pattern, or if you're always getting angry in traffic, or if you always get really, whatever, those toxic blocks in our life, how to fix those. And then I also have how to build good habits. So to use the Neurocycle to build Like they can take your book where you teach them, they can use a neurocycle to learn what you teach them to build good eating habits into their life. So it's building, so I talk about neurocycles for building good communication, good diet, good exercise, etc., etc., etc. So they are trying to give you the whole picture, and then throughout their little hacks, like if you get stuck in people pleasing, what do you do in the moment? If you have that argument, what do you do in the moment? So there's the little 5-second ones. Gosh, I've said such a lot. I always say a lot.
Oh, I love this so much, and your book is so rich. It's just absolutely rich with just wisdom. And I want to encourage everybody to already our branches are spectacular, but to take it another step is to put some of these things into action for ourselves. So I want to encourage everybody to get their copy right now, Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess. This book is coming out right now. We super need this. So I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for you putting your time and energy and your experience into creating something this special for everyone. And can you let everybody know where they can pick the book up and also where they can just follow you and find out more information?
Absolutely. Well, they can pick up the book wherever books are sold, but they can go to the website cleaningupyourmentalmess.com, and then that'll take you to all Amazon and everything. My website's drleaf.com, and my Instagram and all my social media handles are Dr. Caroline Leaf. And there's tons of stuff on all of those. Like all of us, we're all giving good content on our pages. But that's where they can follow me on Instagram. They'll get access to everything as well. Through there, you can get to the book and so on. So drleaf.com and Dr. Caroline Leaf on Instagram. And wherever books are sold.
Dr. Leaf, this is one of my favorite episodes.
Oh,
this is
thank
so
you.
rewarding, and I mean, this is going beyond what we see out here, which is so focused on the minutia of, again, we mentioned earlier, the mechanistic thinking about how all this stuff works. And it makes us feel disempowered because once something's wrong with the mechanism, you're broken.
Exactly.
And that's the end of the story. So this was incredibly empowering, and I appreciate you so much. I can't wait to talk more.
I can't wait to talk more as well. I'm looking forward to interviewing you soon on your book. So that's going to be exciting, and I really appreciate that. If people also want to know more about the neurocycle, I've got a podcast, Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess, where I'll be interviewing you, but I do a lot of neurocycles on there for people just to get the hang of it as well. So that's another place they can connect with me. But thank you, Sean.
Awesome.
It's been so great. Thank you for giving me so much time to share all the concepts, and I really hope it helps all your viewers and listeners.
Awesome. It definitely will. I appreciate you so very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Caroline Leaf, everybody. Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here to up-level your health today.
You're in big trouble. So we think this is why the people with diabetes, even pre-diabetes, who are overweight or obese and older, are particularly vulnerable. It's not the only reason, but it's clearly one of the smoking guns.
This is